In the summer of 1862, a 35-year-old leather merchant named William Bradley Isham rented a sprawling wood frame house on a lush green hill on the northernmost end of the island of Manhattan. The rental was intended as a seasonal retreat, but the businessman with the blue eyes, beard, and mustache made a connection with the land, and, 2 years later, returned to purchase the home and surrounding property. For half a century, the Isham family tended to their uptown oasis, in the Inwood section, before donating the land to the city for use as a public park, which now bears their family name. The Isham's two-story house sat squarely on a hilltop, with sweeping views of both the Harlem and Hudson rivers. The home's previous owner, Dr. Floyd T. Ferris, was the principal physician to the cholera hospital on Duane Street. Ferris had occupied the home until his death 7 years before the Isham's first visit. The doctor's old home, likely built in the 1850s, had an unusual design. 3 extended wings together formed a cross that maximized both light and ventilation. It is an interesting brick and frame building of peculiar shape, having a spacious central hall with a winding staircase and gallery from which rooms extended in 3 wings, wrote turn-of-the-century historian Reginald Bolton in 1924. Bolton, a scholar of the American Revolution, noted the significance of the location. The hill had provided one of the highest vantage points in the city during the Revolutionary War. According to Bolton, Isham Hill was the scene of some events of the Revolution, when, in November 1776, the Hessian advance parties took possession and erected on the edge of the park, looking south, 2 redoubts. A sharp encounter took place on November 8th, when the Pennsylvania troops ensconced in the woods of Inwood Hill drove in the Hessian outposts and fired their quarters. The entire Hessian division moved over the park area, where, on November 16, 1776, the assault on Fort Washington was made. The property's 24 acres included greenhouses, a gardener's cottage, a cold spring, and a stable. Half a century after William Isham assumed control of the property, his son, Samuel, described the move to Inwood. "My father," Samuel said, "leased the Kingsbridge place for the summer of 1862. The next year we went to Newburgh, but in 1864 he bought the place. It was then very rough, much of it a tangled thicket of red cedars, but the lawns about the house had been carefully kept up. He cleared it, moved the stable from the top of the hill to its present place, regraded the whole hill from top to bottom, planted nearly all the trees that now remain, and, in fact, remade the place into about what it is now. At that time, the surroundings were only beginning to be suburban. The Kingsbridge Road was a good dirt country road, long regretted by us after it had been graded and widened, for the new street remained for years unpaved, a waste of dust in dry weather, and a slough of mud and wet. One relic we got from the operation, the old milestone, 12 miles from City Hall, had stood some 100 feet below our gate when it was thrown into the rubbish heap by workmen. My father got it from the foreman and had it built into the wall by our gatepost. It had been a well-known milestone, by the way. For many years, up to a comparatively short time before we bought the place, the old Dykeman house just beyond it had been the last stopping place of the drivers on their way to the city. The cattle pastured overnight in the meadows east of the road, and the next day were driven to the Bull's Head at 23rd Street. Our house, which was built, I think, by the Mr. Ferris from whom we bought the place, has remained almost unchanged. In fact, its peculiar plan rendered extension practically impossible. I suppose it dates from the 50s. The older traditions of the place go back to the Revolution, when, like all adjacent country, it was fought over. There were traces of earthworks toward the creek, and in the grading and plowing there were cannon and musket balls turned up with the old buckles and buttons. The lime kilns, which were the peculiar characteristic of the place, may have been pre-revolutionary. From our gate, up to the north end of the island, extends almost the only marble formation in Manhattan. I have the impression that there is one other. Down by the creek, there were kilns built to burn the marble into lime. The old stone building, now a barn, was used to store the lime, which was shipped in sloops from a dock in the creek. This end of the place was probably its main center of activity a century ago. There was a small house there in 1862 used by a gardener, and, though that was comparatively recent, there were other signs, like apple orchards and the like, which indicated that a farmhouse had stood there. A stronger argument is a spring of pure, cold water on the bank at the edge of the swamp. Near this spring still stands a cherry tree, which must now be well over 100 years old, and which shows its age. It used to yield an abundance of dark, sweet cherries, and I suppose it may have been the sole surviving specimen of the Dykeman cherry, a species famous in its day, but now supposed to be extinct. My father's farm was for pleasure, and not for profit, but he had been born and brought up in the country, and knew something about it, enough to take great delight in managing his farm. After one of the more extensive grading operations, the hill was sown with wheat, and when the crop was harvested and thrashed, he himself drove the sacks of grain to a grist mill that then stood on Spite and Dival Creek, near the old King's Bridge, and brought back the flour so that he could boast that he had eaten bread raised by himself on Manhattan Island. Isham, born in Ulster, New York, on April 20th, 1827, had assembled a considerable and growing fortune running a hide and leather business amid a fetid stretch of tanneries in an area of downtown known as the Swamp. Since the 1790s, tanners had clustered around the swamp, named for the rivers of toxic runoff and noxious fumes created by what had been once the center of the leather manufacturing in the United States. Isham's base of operations, a 5-story brick building, which he built in 1857, was located on 91 Gold Street. The family also owned 93 Gold Street, next door to the leather warehouse. Both structures would remain in the Isham's hands through the turn of the century. An advertisement in an 1891 edition of Shoe and Leather Reporter describes an importer of leather, the largest dealers in the world, specializing in goat, sheep, deer, and kangaroo skins, as having a branch in Isham's warehouse. The summer of 1862, spent miles from the animal smells, huge vats of tannic acid, and the broken, sickly faces of tannery workers, must have proved curative for the hard-working leather boss. In the spring of 1898, author James Rule Smith visited the Isham estate while conducting a survey of the few remaining natural sources of drinking water in northern Manhattan. While describing a well on the property 20 or so feet from the Isham stable, Rule captured a rural scene hard to imagine today. The Isham Spring is at the foot of one of 4 little fruit trees, which, with 2 others a short distance away, are all that is left of what was perhaps long ago a flourishing orchard. The tree behind the spring looks like a peach tree. Buttercups grow around it. Wild birds sing in the 4 fruit trees and drink at the spring. Their piping song mingles with the whistling tugboats on the canal. The Isham's horses and 3 cows come to the spring about noon for their drink, the cows respectfully giving precedence when a thirsty horse approaches by rising lumberingly and moving away with dignified alacrity. The spring rises at the base of a small rock. It is 18 inches deep and about 20 inches across. Natural rock forms the back of its basin, and in the front a piece of white Kingsbridge marble which has become slimy and yellowish brown. Bubbles rise from the bottom, which is somewhat sandy and over which a conical fungus grows. The water is not cold but cool, although exposed to the direct rays of the sun. I drank from it and found it a trifle salty. Isham, a tall man, even by today's standards, stood 6'6", and was, by all accounts, a doting father. On the Inwood hilltop, Isham and his wife Julia would raise 6 children: Charles, Samuel, William Jr., Porter, Julia, and Flora. At least 3 of Isham's children, Samuel, William, and Charles, attended PS 52 on nearby Academy Street. According to the 1870 federal census, 4 female domestic servants, all Irish, also lived in the household. Throughout the late 1800s, Isham's business flourished. He would also become involved in banking, serving as vice president of the Bank of the Metropolis and the president of the Bond and Mortgage Guarantee Company. Outside the boardroom, Isham was equally at ease mingling with New York society. According to an 1897 biography, Isham was a member of the Metropolitan and Riding Clubs, the Downtown Association, the New England Society, and the National Academy of Design. He was also a patron of the American Museum of Natural History. Locally, he was a generous benefactor of the Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. Isham would also serve as a trustee of the Dyckman Library, which had been incorporated in 1862. In addition to the country home on the Kingsbridge Road, the Ishams also maintained a city residence on East 61st Street near Fifth Avenue. While many in Isham's position might have considered the Inwood property a simple summer home, Isham treated the land like hallowed ground. It is possible, even probable, that Isham planted the giant ginkgo on 212th Street and Broadway, which survives today. A gentleman farmer, Isham is said to have harvested the last wheat grown on the island of Manhattan. In fact, in 1893, Isham sent part of his harvest to the Chicago World's Fair. Poking and prodding through the soil, Isham would occasionally uncover relics by those who came before him, including arrowheads that were later donated by the family to the Museum of the American Indian. In 1911, 2 years after Isham's death, his daughter, Julia Isham Taylor, offered nearly 6 acres of her father's estate to the city for parkland on the condition that the park would bear her family's name. The following year, William Isham's sister, Flora E. Isham, donated more land to preserve the view of the Hudson and the Palisades to the west. On September 28, 1912, more than 5,000 New Yorkers, many of them children, gathered on the lawn of the Isham House for a celebration marking the donation of the Isham land to the city of New York for use as a public park. The celebration began that Saturday morning as 200 schoolkids gathered on West 207th Street and Broadway and marched in a parade up the hill to the Isham House. Constance Smith, a student at nearby public school number 52, sat atop a great bay horse and led the procession. After speeches by Manhattan Borough President George McKinney, Parks Commissioner Charles B. Stover, local historian Reginald Bolton, and others, the children again stole the show with a series of folk dances. The new park totaled 5.5 acres. The park space increased yet again in 1914 when Samuel Isham, by then a noted painter and art critic, collapsed on a golf course and, as per his will, left yet another parcel for public use. In 1917, Julia Isham purchased a rocky outcrop, known for its Inwood marble, along Isham Street and Seaman Avenue, and gifted this piece of land to the Parks Department. Through 2 more acquisitions, these by the Parks Department, in 1925 and 1927, the rough boundaries of the original Isham estate were re-established. In all, it had taken 16 years to stitch together the land we know today as Isham Park. In those early years, there were some notable differences to the park we know today, the most obvious being the house itself, which remained in the park until the 1940s. For decades, the old home was used as both a museum and a meeting place for groups including the Daughters of the American Revolution. Greenhouses also remained on the park grounds through the 1940s. These and other structures would be demolished under the direction of then Parks Commissioner Robert Moses. From 1904, the year the elevated subway arrived at Dyckman Street, until the late 1920s, Inwood was a chaotic neighborhood that was clouded by dust and barren of vegetation. Throughout the district, workers raced to construct new apartment buildings. Demolition crews blasted away huge rock formations, and Broadway, still a dirt road, was often choked with mud. Life in this newly discovered neighborhood often proved nerve-wracking for the new arrivals, and old-timers alike. What an oasis Isham Park must have seemed like to those early Inwood residents. The streets in this territory, wrote the New York Times, are almost entirely bare of trees, and except for the cool and shady retreat offered by Isham Park, there is no place where mothers and children could find relief from the summer heat. There is a large garden at the southeast corner of the park, elm and maple trees around the mansion, and groves of fine trees all over the ground. A magnificent avenue of elm trees border the carriageway leading into the park from the Broadway entrance. This carriageway continues up to the mansion, which is surrounded by well-kept lawns, and the grounds are traversed by numerous winding pathways. On account of the high elevation of the park, there are uninterrupted views looking in nearly every direction. Access can now be had from Broadway and West 212th Street through the old Iron Gateway, and thence by Carriage Road through the Avenue of Elms and around the westerly slope of the hillside up to the mansion. There are large groups of maple and locust trees along the boundary lines of the extension, and these form a most beautiful frame or border for the Hudson River view from the hilltop. Now, for over a century, Isham Park has provided a place of peaceful respite from the chaotic lives of city dwellers. Countless current and former Inwood residents have fond memories of time spent in Isham Park. Mary Miller, who was born in 1918 and lived on Academy Street near Post Avenue, recalled good times spent in the park in an interview with oral historian Sanford Gaster. "We used to go sledding down a hill we called Snake Hill, which is really Park Terrace West. You'd slide down to Isham Street, and if you were really brazen, you would continue all the way down to Broadway, as far as you could go, all the way to Vermilion, sometimes all the way to Sherman. Everybody did it. I never heard of anybody getting hurt. The priests used to do it." There was a section of Isham Park, just across Isham Street, from the Good Shepherd School, and that part had a playground with equipment and everything. Just in front of it were the rocks of the park, which we could climb up and down. Since the play area wasn't fenced, we used to go back and forth from the rocks to the equipment. On the rocks, you could use your imagination. Imagination was everything when we were kids. One rock would be our houses, our apartments, and everything. They used to close off Isham Street after school so kids could go jump rope and skate. Elsa Brady, who was born in 1914, remembered visiting the park when she was around 10 years old. "They used to have band concerts in the summer," Mrs. Brady recalled. "And they would be on the porch playing, and everyone would come up. Your parents would take you. It was the only time you went on the grass. You didn't go on the grass when I was a kid. I mean, everything was taken care of." Rose Mulligan, whose family moved to Inwood in 1923, when she was 6 years old, also had fond memories of the park. "That park was like a flower garden," Mulligan remembered. "It was tended by a caretaker who lived in a lovely cottage there. We had arbors all through the walks, and in June there were roses that I remember very well. Except for the real winter time, there were always flowers. Pretty walks. That's all that I remember it being. There was nothing else you could do. You really couldn't play there. It would be out of place. At least, in front of the house, you could play games." In 2012, Isham Park celebrated its centennial. Once again, a parade of students entered the park from the Broadway entrance as the band played on. Isham descendants Carol Collins Malone and her brother, William Bradley Isham Collins, attended the celebration.
I'm wearing on my lapel a metal button, which is you really can't see from far away, but it says the Isham Park Celebration, September 28, 1912. And when I was a little girl, I found a large trunk full of musty and dusty old letters and photographs in my parents' New York apartment. And along with them, I found this pin, and I was fascinated by the photograph on it and the idea of the Isham Park celebration, the celebration of the gift that my great-aunt Julia gave this land and this house that was standing to the city. And so it's with enormous pleasure that I'm standing here 100 years later wearing the pin that I found when I was so young.
Because of the Isham's civic generosity, future generations can build memories of summer days and playtime atop one of the most beautiful spots in Manhattan. To the Ishams, for this precious gift, we thank you.
the land, and life is all his own. He can go or he can stay. But when the sea gets in your blood, when she calls you must obey. So I'll sing farewell to Carlingford.